Ever feel like you're running on fumes? Like your phone is just perpetually on low battery?
Oh, yeah.
I know I do sometimes. But what if I told you there's this letter written almost 2,000 years ago that speaks directly to that feeling of spiritual depletion?
It's true. We're diving into Colossians today, and this letter from the Apostle Paul is all about tapping into the ultimate power source, our connection with Christ.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but before we plug in, let's get some context. Who are these Colossians, and why did Paul need to jolt them back to life, so to speak?
Well, the Colossians were a relatively new church in what's now modern-day Turkey.
Okay.
Paul, writing from prison in Rome, had never actually visited them, but he'd heard reports of some pretty alarming teachings creeping in.
Alarming how. Was it like those spam emails promising overnight riches or weight loss miracles?
Kind of. These teachings were a blend of Christianity with other philosophies, creating what we now call Gnosticism. Imagine believing that secret knowledge, like a hidden password, unlocks true spiritual enlightenment. That was the appeal of Gnosticism, and it was threatening to pull the Colossians away from the pure truth of the gospel.
So it's like a spiritual counterfeit, promising a shortcut to God, but ultimately leading them astray.
Exactly. And Paul, being the fierce defender of the faith that he wasn't having it. He lays out a powerful argument in Colossians, emphasizing that Christ is not just one path among many, but the only way to God, the only life source of true life and power.
Hmm. This is where I sometimes get tripped up. I mean, the idea of only one way can feel, well, a bit exclusive.
I understand, but Paul wasn't trying to be restrictive. It's more like he was pointing to an absolute truth. Think of it this way. If you need a heart transplant, you don't settle for a half-working heart or a heart from a different species.
Right.
You need the perfect match, the one designed for you. That's what Christ is, the perfect, life-giving connection we all need.
Okay, that analogy makes sense. So Paul is setting the record straight, making it clear that there's no substitute for Christ. But he doesn't stop there.
Not at all. He goes on to unpack the incredible implications of this connection with Christ. He describes Jesus as the image of the invisible God, the creator of everything, the head of the church, and the victor over death. It's a breathtaking declaration of who Jesus is and what he's accomplished.
Wow, it sounds like Paul is pulling out all the stops to help the Colossians grasp the magnitude of their relationship with Christ. He's not just giving them a spiritual pep talk. He's laying a solid foundation for their faith.
You got it. And this foundation was crucial, especially in the face of those misleading teachings trying to infiltrate the church. By clearly defining who Christ is, Paul was equipping the Colossians to discern truth from error and stand firm in their faith.
So it's like he's giving them a spiritual compass and a map, helping them navigate the confusing terrain of competing ideas and philosophies.
That's a great way to put it. He's not just saying, don't listen to those other voices.
Yeah.
He's equipping them to understand why those voices are leading them in the wrong direction.
This is fascinating. So we've established that Paul is fiercely advocating for the centrality of Christ. But how does he bridge that theological foundation to the practical realities of daily life? How did he want the Colossians to actually live out this connection with Christ?
That's where things get really interesting, and that's where we'll pick up next time. It's like building a house, you know?
Yeah.
You can't just slap on a fancy roof and call it a day. You need a strong foundation first. And
Right.
that's what Paul is doing in the first few chapters of Colossians, laying a solid theological foundation about who Christ is.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still curious about how this foundation translates into actual blueprints for living.
Hmm.
How do we take those grand theological truths and apply them to the nitty-gritty of everyday life?
That's where Colossians 3 comes in. It's like Paul is saying, all right, now that we've got the foundation down, let's start framing the walls and putting up the drywall. He shifts gears from grand pronouncements to very specific instructions on how to live out our faith in practical ways.
Give me an example. What kind of construction materials is Paul recommending?
Well, one of the first things he tackles is this idea of setting our minds on things above. He writes, set your minds on things above, not on earthly things.
I've heard that verse before,
Yeah.
but I'll be honest, it always sounded a bit, well, ethereal.
Yeah.
Like, am I supposed to walk around with my head in the clouds all day?
Not exactly. It's not about ignoring our responsibilities here on Earth. It's more about aligning our priorities with God's will and kingdom. It's like having a dual citizenship. We're citizens of heaven even while we're living here on Earth. So our ultimate allegiance, our deepest desires, our core values, those should be rooted in eternity, not in the fleeting things of this world.
Okay, that makes it a bit more down to earth. So how do we practically set our minds on things above in the middle of a traffic jam or while folding laundry?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a daily, even moment-by-moment choice to focus our thoughts, our energy, our intentions on what truly matters. Think of it like training a muscle. The more we practice aligning our thoughts with God's truth, the more naturally it becomes.
So it's about intentionally shifting our focus from the temporal to the eternal.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those pesky earthly desires that keep pulling us back down?
Paul addresses that too. He gets pretty specific, actually, about the earthly things we need to put to death.
Hmm.
Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, which he equates with idolatry.
Wow, he doesn't sugarcoat it, does he?
Nope. And I think that's important because those desires, if left unchecked, can wreak havoc in our lives and relationships. They can distract us, deceive us, and ultimately enslave us.
So it's not just about being good or avoiding bad behavior. It's about recognizing those desires for what they are, distractions from the true source of life and fulfillment.
Exactly. And Paul doesn't just leave us hanging with a list of don'ts. He also gives us some powerful do's qualities to cultivate that reflect Christ's character. Compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience.
It's like he's saying, okay, now that you've cleared out the clutter, let's decorate. Let's fill your lives with things that radiate beauty and truth.
That's a great way to put it. And he emphasizes that this transformation isn't a one-time makeover. It's an ongoing process. We're constantly being renewed and shaped into the image of Christ.
One thing that really strikes me about Colossians is how Paul seamlessly weaves together theology and practical living. He's not just teaching abstract concepts. He's showing how those concepts impact how we treat others, how we navigate relationships.
You're right. And that's where we see the rubber really meet the road. Paul spends a good chunk of Colossians 3 and 4 addressing specific relationships. Husbands and wives, parents and children, even slaves and masters, which was a very real social dynamic in his time.
So he's not just talking about personal piety. He's talking about how our faith shapes our interactions with everyone, regardless of their social standing or position in life.
Absolutely. And he emphasizes love, forgiveness, respect, and service as the building blocks for healthy Christ-centered relationships. It's like he's saying, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. Let your faith be evident in how you treat the people around you.
It's almost like our relationships become a testing ground for our faith, a place where we can see if those Colossian renovations are really taking hold.
I like that analogy. And this brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the idea of combating those misleading teachings that were creeping into the Colossian church.
Right, those spiritual counterfeits that promised shortcuts and secret knowledge, but ultimately led people astray.
Exactly. And I think it's fascinating to consider how those false teachings might have manifested in their relationships.
That's an interesting thought. How so?
Well, imagine someone buying into the Gnostic idea of spiritual elitism, that they possess secret knowledge that made them superior to others. How might that have affected their interactions with their spouse, their children, their neighbors?
I can see how that kind of thinking could easily lead to pride, judgment, and a lack of empathy. It's like they're building walls instead of bridges.
Exactly. And that's the opposite of what Paul is advocating for. He's calling the Colossians to humility, to servanthood, to genuine love and respect for all people, regardless of their social status or spiritual understanding.
It's a reminder that true spiritual maturity isn't about puffing ourselves up. It's about humbling ourselves and allowing Christ to transform us from the inside out.
Beautifully said. And that transformation, that ongoing process of becoming more like Christ, should be evident in every aspect of our lives, especially in our relationships.
So we've explored how Paul lays a solid theological foundation in Colossians, and we've unpacked some of the practical implications for daily living and relationships. But I'm curious, what specifically were some of the false teachings Paul was combating? Can we get a bit more granular on those spiritual counterfeits? It's like we're trying to decode a spiritual spam filter,
Yeah.
figuring out what to block and what to let through.
Exactly. And some of these false teachings were pretty tricky. They weren't outright denials of Christ, but rather subtle distortions of the gospel message.
Okay.
They mixed in elements of Jewish legalism, emphasizing strict adherence to rules and rituals as a way to earn God's favor.
So it was like they were trying to add a bunch of extra steps to the spiritual GPS, making the route to God unnecessarily complicated.
Precisely. It's like those recipe hacks that promise amazing results but end up adding a ton of extra ingredients and steps for no real benefit.
Right.
Paul was reminding the Colossians that salvation isn't a prize to be won through our own efforts. It's a free gift received through faith in Christ alone.
That makes me think of all the times I've tried to uh, DIY my spiritual life, thinking I could earn God's approval through my own good works or religious practices. It's exhausting and ultimately pointless.
It is. And it goes against the very heart of the gospel, which is all about grace and surrender.
Were there any other spiritual spam messages circulating in Colossus?
Yes, some were promoting a form of early Gnosticism, which, as we discussed earlier, emphasized secret knowledge and mystical experiences as the path to spiritual enlightenment.
So it's like they were trying to create an exclusive spiritual club, claiming to have insider information that most people didn't have access to.
Exactly, and this created a hierarchy within the church, with some claiming to be more spiritually advanced than others. It's like those multi-level marketing schemes that promise you'll reach the top if you just recruit enough people and sell enough products.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for division and disunity within the church.
It was. And Paul was adamant that true spiritual maturity isn't about climbing a spiritual ladder or accumulating secret knowledge. It's about knowing Christ intimately and allowing his spirit to transform us from the inside out.
So he was calling the Colossians back to the simplicity and purity of the gospel message, reminding them that Christ alone is the source of true wisdom, salvation, and spiritual fulfillment.
Absolutely. And I think that's a message we desperately need to hear today with so many spiritual ideas and philosophies vying for our attention. It's easy to get distracted by the latest spiritual fads or self-help gurus, but Paul reminds us that there's no substitute for a deep, abiding relationship with Christ.
It's like he's saying, hey, don't waste your time chasing after shadows or trying to hack your way to spiritual enlightenment. The real deal is right here in Christ. Plug into him and experience true life and transformation.
Perfectly put, and I love how Paul, even in the midst of addressing these serious theological issues, doesn't lose sight of the personal touch. He ends his letter with a series of greetings, mentioning specific individuals by name and sending words of encouragement.
That's a great point. It reminds us that theology isn't just about abstract concepts, it's about real people living out their faith in community.
Exactly, and it's a beautiful example of how we can encourage and support one another on this journey of faith. We need each other. We need those authentic connections that remind us we're not alone in the midst of our struggles and doubts.
It makes me think of those early church gatherings described in the book of Acts. They shared meals, supported one another, and spread the gospel together. It wasn't just about attending a weekly service. It was about living life together through thick and thin.
That's a powerful image, and I think it's something we can strive for in our own communities today, to create spaces where people feel safe to be vulnerable, to ask tough questions, to wrestle with their doubts, and to encourage one another on the journey of faith.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Colossians,
Mhm.
what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this letter?
I hope they're inspired to go back and read Colossians for themselves, to let Paul's words sink deep into their hearts and minds. It's a letter that's as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago, reminding us that Christ is supreme, our connection with him is vital, and our lives should reflect his transforming power.
It's a call to live out our faith in practical, tangible ways, not just in our private devotions, but in our relationships, our workplaces, our communities, in every sphere of our lives.
Absolutely. It's about letting that Colossian renovation project extend beyond our own hearts and minds, impacting the world around us for the better.
This has been an incredible deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.